So I think I've reached the point where all my major ideas have finally integrated into something that is cohesive enough that I don't have to have a whole bunch of separate theories. So lucidity as my religion, I had wanted that to be basically the same exact theory as Deus Ex Machina theory, but it just says that there's a God. And, to try to stick as close to Deus Ex Machina theory without changing anything as possible. Because I didn't want the theory to be filled with a whole bunch of non sequiturs or a whole bunch of assumptions or religious, assertions that don't have any rational basis. So now that I have found that there is a necessity for not necessarily a God, but something that exists beyond the limits of the theory, because of the fact that we have to have that infinity plus one referent at the very end, because of the fact that at the zeroth dimension you have one referent. Therefore, at the infinite dimension, you have to have infinity plus one referent. So that fact means that I can then deify that plus one referent and call that plus one referent God and close everything in that kind of a context. For me personally, that works fine. Now, I also need to have an atheistic, or at the very least agnostic, theory that does not deify that plus one referent. And there's two ways to do that. So I could either take that plus one referent to mean plus one of the totality of what I know, which is, my own personal infinitude is a totality, my own personal totality of what I know. And then add one onto that. Well, that's just learning from other people, but that's not saying much. So you got to go a little further than that, say that the totality of all possible reference, and then add one referent onto that, that could just be the growth of the system. It just is saying then that while our understanding and our facts about reality are systemic and structured and static, that doesn't mean the system, reality itself is. So the plus one referent at the end is just saying, and then some. It's growing. It's not done. It's not a static object. Even the totality at the very end is a totality in motion. It's a totality that is constantly growing and evolving. So that's one way of viewing it without God. And then the other way that I could think of without invoking God, or that constant evolution of reality, is to say that whatever that is, if we were to refer to it, then it wouldn't be the plus one reference. So we're just referring to the unknown. And that means that it's not saying anything about what reality is or isn't. It's not saying anything about what reality is doing or isn't doing, or even what we're knowing or not knowing individually. It's just saying that the plus one referent is something that we just don't know what it is. So it's something that has to deal with something that's beyond the limits of discernibility, that cannot ever be discerned. And we don't necessarily have to call the unknown God. We could just say it's unknown. So maybe it isn't the Christian God, maybe it isn't Buddha, maybe it isn't Brahman. We don't know what it is. Whatever it is, maybe it's the Tao. There's all kinds of ways of looking at that, clothing that ineffable finality. But that's what it is it's an ineffable finality. And it's unknowable. It cannot ever be known. So since it can't ever be known, it could be God or it could be something else. And maybe the reason that it can't ever be known is because if we knew that, then the system would be closed. If the system was closed, then it wouldn't continue to grow, it wouldn't move, it wouldn't change, and then there wouldn't be any time, and really there probably wouldn't even be any space either, and everything would just collapse into a singularity and cease to exist. So it doesn't necessitate that that is God, but it does necessitate that it's beyond whatever we can discern. And it's open. Its essential, quintessential property is openness. It is open, not closed. And that, I think, is probably the beginning of religion, is the openness. And then when we try to close that openness, that's when we get into dogma. And we can have insanities. I've had so many episodes. I had one today where I thought that I was talking to God directly. And it is because I have a tendency of believing in unfalsifiable claims. And then I take those unfalsifiable claims and I can attach logic to that, but I have to presume that unfalsifiable claim is true. I can't know it because it's unfalsifiable, so I can't discern whether it's true or not. When that happens, I tend to become really mystical and believe in impulses and feelings and things like that, rather than facts. Which is all to say, I believe that I have finally reached a point where I can integrate all of my thoughts into one system. And that one system doesn't necessarily contradict Christianity. In fact, in many ways, it bolsters it. I am that I am. There's no way of making a graven image of God. There's a few passages in the Bible that come to mind that do seem to bolster it. The one thing that might shatter some worlds is, if my theory is true, it's also equally implying that anything that I can know can't be God. That's the part that kind of scares me, because basically what that's saying is every single person who has ever believed that God spoke to them is wrong. And that includes Jesus, and it includes the prophets, and that kind of destroys, at the very least, the traditional and conventional view of Christianity and Christ. So it calls a lot of that into question, and basically is saying then that, according to this theory, what that means is, for Christianity, all of those people were crazy. And they just thought they were talking to God, but in fact were just delusional. And as well-meaning as they may be, and as full of good intent as they may have been, that doesn't detract from the fact that they were simply factually wrong. They simply made a human error and did not understand what was going on. That they felt or thought something that they couldn't explain, and so they called that God. But then the problem happens when they say, and God said this. And then it's like, well, no, because if God spoke it, then whatever it is that we heard would be knowable. Whatever that is can't be God. So if God spoke, then we would know, and we would source that knowledge, that source of speech, as God. And we'd say, I may not be able to know God in totality, but I can't, anything that I experience cannot be God. Anything that I see cannot be God. Anything that I hear cannot be God. Any thought that I think can't be put, well, it may have been put there by God, though, if God spoke. While the speech itself wouldn't be God, it's still possible that God could have some kind of divine intervention. And the nature of that divine intervention seems to be that, if we're going to look at creation, it seems to be happening from the center, zero dimension, subjectivity, outward. From subjectivity to relativity to objectivity, and so on. So if that's the case, then if God uses divine intervention, then the divine intervention happens at 0D, at the subjective level. That subjective change then elicits a relative change. So it would still ostensibly fit within the realm of subjectivity and in the realm of relativity, and it would fit within these fields, but it would move or cascade or cause a ripple throughout the rest of the dimensions, all the way back to infinity, the infinite dimension, the last dimension. So if that's the direction that God is creating, then that seems to also be the direction that God would have divinely intervened, which then means that either the miracles are true and Jesus was able to physically walk on water because of some subjective change in his soul that then elicited some kind of change in logic, in the framework of the laws of physics and things like that, which then elicited a change in the physical manifestation of him walking on water. So in other words, if that was divine intervention, and if that did happen, the way that it would have happened, according to my theory, is that some kind of a subjective change, which I guess we'll just call faith, then caused a change in logic, and it would seem that that change was so absolute that the entire system of laws that govern logic and physics changed because of his faith. Now, if that's true, then anybody with that much faith would be able to make the laws of physics bend to their whim, and they would be able to create new things out of nothing. They would be able to, raise people from the dead. All that stuff would be possible, and then some. You could have created an entire world and then gone inside of it. And limitless, unlimited power would be the result of that. So, is that necessarily impossible? No, it's not. And the reason that it isn't is because we can't close the system and say, and that's all there is. So, because of the fact that we have to say that there's a limit to the theory that doesn't include something in reality that is necessarily, not ostensibly, but necessarily existent as that +1 referent, because of the fact that there has to be something that exists outside of the theory in order for it to function, whatever that is could be God, and then there could be divine intervention, and then there could be miracles, and yet there wouldn't be now, and yet it's the same theory in both cases. In other words, you don't have to have a theory of evolution to explain physical reality and then a theory about religious dogma in order to explain miracles and stuff that we can't explain with science. And lately, I think that that's been what the case has been, is that we have this two worlds thing going on where in one world, all the laws of physics apply and everything makes sense. And then in another world, nothing makes any sense and everything is just an arbitrary fairy tale story time for little Jimmy to go to sleep at night. And there's not really any logic or reason behind it. It's just a whole bunch of traditional logical fallacies and random events that don't make any sense and follow no line of reasoning at all. So there's a way to reconcile those worlds by saying that everything that we can't explain inside of the theory can be put into the category of that +1 referent that must exist outside the theory. And that means that it's either way too advanced for us to be able to replicate with science yet, or it's something that is so subjectively difficult that it would require an absolute devotion to God in order to attain it. And of course, ostensibly by attaining it, you wouldn't even want it anymore because, that sounds like the norm for this kind of thing. If you ask of it, oh yeah, you could receive it, but then you have to go through a whole bunch of other stuff. You end up being used as an instrument of God. The stuff that you asked for is there, but it's only there in order to be used for the good of God's plan, etc. So even though you have access to all these powers, you would never be able to feel fulfilled simply by attaining them, because you'd then have to use them for something else. And that something else would then be the thing that you're after, not those powers. So is that the case? Maybe. It's possible. And for the first time, there's a, I wouldn't say scientific, but there's a logical, philosophical, rational theory that would still allow a rational person to believe in miracles if they wanted to, because they would rationally be able to realize there is a limit to logic, and that limit of logic cannot be the same limit as reality, because there are real things that are illogical, namely me. So since there's a limit to logic, then we can ascribe all kinds of things: miracles, God, divine intervention, the devil, whatever you want to throw in there. All kinds of things, anything and everything can be part of reality. And yet the person can still retain their rationale and still be a rational person while admitting that that's all possible. It's kind of refreshing, but it's also kind of, I'm going to have to walk around in these shoes for a while before I really feel comfortable.